Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
But
Today we're
yeah,
Volume 4
we're diving into
to Plato's dialogue.
some pretty heady stuff today.
It includes
Parmenides
Parmenides and
is
Theaetetus.
Theaetetus.
Yeah.
And we're going to explore
Big question.
some pretty big questions like the nature of reality and
Yeah.
what it even means
What does it even mean?
to know something.
To know something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
What's really interesting about these dialogues is that we see Socrates at different stages of his philosophical journey.
oh, absolutely.
In Parmenides, he's a young man,
He's young.
eager to test his ideas.
He's a young guy, and he's
The renowned
Run up against
philosopher Parmenides.
a veteran in Parmenides.
It's like a philosophical sparring match, right? The young up-and-comer versus the seasoned veteran.
Totally, yeah. It's like a masterclass in dialectic.
Yeah.
He's in
Yeah.
the very zone.
So what kind of mental weightlifting are they doing in Parmenides?
They're tackling
What's a big one?
the core.
One concept they're
One,
playing with.
which is this, it's Parmenides' idea that ultimately all of reality
Okay.
boils down to a single unified principle.
So that sounds pretty abstract.
It is abstract. It is, it's one of those things that, it's really hard to wrap your brain around.
Right. I'm ready to have my mind blown.
Okay, well,
Lay it on me.
I'll try my best. So imagine trying to describe a sunset
Okay.
to someone who's been blind since birth.
I see where you're going.
Right. Like your words would fail
Yeah.
because they rely on
Comparisons.
and contrasts,
Yeah.
things that someone who's never experienced sight can't grasp. And that's kind of what happens when we try to define the one.
Okay, so we're so used to defining things in relation to other things.
Right.
But the one, if it truly exists, it's beyond all that.
At the foundation.
It's like the ultimate foundation.
the thing that everything else rests upon.
The thing that everything else rests upon. And that's where it starts to get kind of paradoxical.
Okay.
Because if the one is truly one,
Right.
it can't have parts.
Right.
It can't be a whole because a whole is made up of parts.
I see what you're saying.
It can't even be in any place because even being in itself implies a container and a contained.
Wow. So the very act of trying to describe it,
You break it.
to pin it down with
You
language,
break it apart.
breaks it apart.
Yeah,
It's like trying to hold water in your hands.
exactly. You can't do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that Parmenides is really trying to show Socrates.
So what's the takeaway here for someone like me
Yeah,
who maybe isn't a philosopher,
yeah.
but still wants to understand the world a little better?
Think about
Mm-hmm.
think about a time you've had like a disagreement with someone, maybe about politics or religion.
Yeah.
A lot of times those disagreements stem from the fact that we're using the same words,
Right.
but we're attaching different meanings to them. And I think that's one of the things that Parmenides is really trying to get at.
Okay.
It's like, let's be aware of those underlying assumptions.
Right.
Let's be more precise
Mhm.
with our language.
Being more precise with our language.
And let's recognize that
Yeah.
our words can never fully capture the complexity of reality.
That's such a valuable insight,
Mm.
especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information and opinions.
It's so easy to get caught up in the rhetoric
Yeah.
and forget to actually like
Mhm.
examine the underlying
Yeah.
ideas and assumptions.
And it leads us perfectly into the next dialogue, Theaetetus, where Plato shifts the focus from the nature of reality
To the nature of knowledge itself.
to the nature of knowledge itself.
Yeah.
So after wrestling with those mind-bending paradoxes about the nature of reality itself,
Mm.
Plato takes us on a completely different journey in Theaetetus. But there's a fascinating connection here, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely.
Both dialogues ultimately challenge our assumptions about what we think we know,
Yeah.
whether it's about being or about knowledge itself.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, in Theaetetus, we see Socrates engaging with this brilliant young mathematician named Theaetetus,
Okay.
and they're trying to answer this
What is knowledge?
seemingly simple question,
Right.
what is knowledge?
Yeah.
And it's funny because it's one of those things that
Yeah.
you think, oh, I know what knowledge is,
Other things.
but then when you really start to dig into it,
Yeah.
it gets really slippery.
Yeah. It's like, I know my own name.
Right.
I know that water is wet.
Yeah.
But when you really try to define what knowing means,
What does it mean to know?
it gets slippery.
It does.
Yeah.
And Theaetetus starts off by suggesting this idea that, well, maybe knowledge is just perception, right?
Yeah.
Like what we see, what we hear, what we touch.
That's how we experience the world.
That's our experience.
It makes sense on the surface.
Right.
But I'm guessing Socrates, the master of poking holes in arguments.
Of course.
Has some thoughts on that.
Socrates, he's not satisfied with that. He uses a bunch of examples to
All right.
show how perception
Yeah.
can be unreliable.
Okay.
He brings up dreams,
Okay.
hallucinations,
Yeah.
optical illusions,
Yeah.
times when our senses basically trick us.
Right. So my eyes can deceive me.
Yeah,
I can see a mirage in the desert and think it's a lake.
right.
But that doesn't mean I know
That's-
there's water there.
That's not knowledge.
Okay.
So then they try on this idea of true belief.
Okay.
So maybe knowledge is simply having a belief that happens to be true.
Okay.
But Socrates points out that
But you can have a true belief just by chance.
you can stumble onto a true belief by pure chance.
Right. Like I could just randomly
Without any real understanding.
guess the correct answer on a multiple choice test.
Totally.
Doesn't mean I know the material.
Exactly. So then they add another layer. What about true belief with a justification? So maybe knowledge is having a true belief and being able to explain why you believe it.
Okay, that seems closer to what we usually think of as knowledge.
Right.
Not just believing something,
Right.
but having reasons to back it up.
Yeah, so it's like true belief plus reasons. But even then, they run into some snags.
Oh, really?
Because how do you determine what a good justification is?
Okay.
Can a belief be justified even if it turns out to be false?
Right.
And what about those times when we have, sort of like a gut feeling about something, an intuition?
Yeah.
We always articulate that.
It's like Plato is peeling back layers of an onion, and each layer reveals another layer of complexity.
Totally.
But does this dialogue actually give us a clear answer
That's the thing, it doesn't.
to the question,
It ends without
what is knowledge?
a definitive answer.
Okay.
And I think some scholars think that Plato is suggesting that
Yeah.
knowledge is something more
That's just what we know,
than just
how we know it.
a collection of facts or justified beliefs.
Is he hinting at something deeper,
It could be.
like wisdom or understanding?
Maybe. Yeah. He uses this great metaphor in the dialogue. He compares Socrates to a midwife.
Okay.
So Socrates isn't trying to force feed Theaetetus his own ideas.
Mhm.
He's trying to help him give birth to
Okay.
his own understanding.
I love that.
Right.
A philosophical midwife.
Yeah.
It makes me think about how true learning isn't about passively absorbing information.
Right.
It's about actively engaging with ideas,
Mhm.
questioning them, refining them,
It's about that active process.
and ultimately giving birth to our own understanding.
Yeah, it's like you're wrestling with the ideas.
Yeah.
You're not just taking them in.
Right.
Yeah.
And in a world saturated with information,
Especially in today's world.
that's a crucial skill.
We're just bombarded.
We're bombarded with facts, opinions, claims every day.
Constantly.
Theaetetus challenges us
It's like drinking from a fire hose.
to be discerning,
Yeah.
to question our sources,
Absolutely.
and to be critical thinkers.
To be critical thinkers. Yeah, and not to just accept things.
So it's not enough to just have a belief, even if it's true.
Right.
We need to understand why we believe it,
Why do you feel like that?
where that belief came from,
Yeah.
and whether it stands up to scrutiny.
Where did you get that information?
I'm starting to see how these ancient dialogues
They're so
are
relevant
incredibly relevant
to our lives today.
to our modern lives.
Even though they were written
Yeah.
thousands of years ago.
Yeah, it's amazing.
The questions are still the same.
Okay, so we've explored the nature of reality in Parmenides
Uh-huh.
and grappled with the definition of knowledge in Theaetetus.
Yeah.
Now we're facing the sophist. What exactly is a sophist? And why did Plato dedicate a whole dialogue to them?
Well, the sophists were these fascinating figures in ancient Greece.
Okay.
They were really, really good at
Yeah.
rhetoric, at argumentation.
Right.
They could persuade crowds. They could win debates.
So kind of like skilled lawyers who could argue any side of a case,
Exactly. Yeah. Like
regardless of whether they believed in it.
they were masters of language.
Okay.
Right. So they could
Yeah.
make a case for anything, whether
Yeah.
or not they actually believed it.
So they were seen as kind of slippery characters,
Yeah. A little bit slippery.
able to twist words and logic to their advantage.
Yeah. They were more concerned with
Hmm.
winning the argument
Okay.
than necessarily finding the truth.
So in the sophist, Plato is trying to define
He's trying to pin down
what exactly makes a sophist,
this slippery figure.
and how does he go about doing that?
It's tough.
It seems like it'd be hard to define someone
Yeah.
who's essentially a master of deception.
Right. Because they were constantly shifting,
Yeah.
changing their tactics.
Yeah.
But in trying to define the sophist, Plato stumbles upon some really interesting questions
All kinds of questions.
about the nature of reality,
Okay.
appearance, and the possibility of falsehood.
Hold on. How does defining a sophist lead to questions about falsehood?
Okay, so and reality.
Remember how in Parmenides we talked about
Yeah.
the one, this ultimate reality?
Yeah.
Well, in Sophist, he tackles
Yeah.
the flip side of that.
Not being everything that isn't.
Not being, exactly. The concept of nothingness.
The absence of something.
Right. Which is really hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
But think about it this way.
Okay.
If a sophist is someone who can argue convincingly for something that's false,
Okay.
they're essentially dealing with not being.
So to understand how sophists can pull off this trick,
Right.
how they can make falsehood appear as truth,
Yeah.
Plato has to grapple with
He has to grapple
the
with.
very nature of falsehood.
What is falsehood? How
Yeah.
can something that isn't
Right.
somehow be?
Yeah, how can something that isn't somehow be?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a really, really tricky question.
Yeah.
And it leads him down this really fascinating path.
Where he examines different types of imitation,
Okay.
the relationship between words and images, and even touches on this idea of like different levels of reality.
It's almost like a precursor to our modern concept of virtual reality.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Wow. So it sounds like the sophist is a real mind bender,
It is.
even by Plato's standards.
It's one of the toughest dialogues to really wrap your head around.
But how does all this relate to us living in the 21st century?
Well, think about the world we live in.
Yeah.
Fake news.
Yeah.
Social media manipulation.
Yeah.
Political spin.
We're constantly bombarded with information that's designed to persuade us,
Yeah.
often regardless of whether it's true.
So in a way, we're all dealing with the legacy of the sophists.
Mhm.
So Plato is giving us a framework for understanding
Well-
not just the tricks of the sophists,
Yeah.
but the very nature of deception itself.
I think that's a great point.
That's incredibly relevant
Yeah.
in today's world.
And it's not just about being able to spot falsehood.
It's also about understanding the power of language and
Mm.
how it can be used to shape
Yeah.
our perceptions and our beliefs.
It's like Plato's giving us a toolkit
Yes.
for critical thinking.
Yeah, it's like a mental workout.
A way to navigate a world where truth and falsehood
Right.
are constantly battling it out.
They are.
So after exploring these complex ideas
Yeah.
about sophistry, not being,
Yeah.
and the very fabric of reality,
Right.
you might expect Plato to wrap things up
You'd think so.
with some neat conclusions,
Right.
a tidy summary
A nice little bow.
of what he's discovered.
But that's not how Plato rolls.
I have a feeling that's not how Plato rolls.
No.
So what does he do?
He leaves us with questions.
Okay.
More questions.
So after all that mental gymnastics,
Yeah.
he's essentially saying, okay, now it's your turn
Yeah, he's like, all right, I've given you the tools.
to grapple with these questions.
Now go out and use them.
The search for truth continues.
And that's what makes these dialogues so fascinating.
It reminds me that true learning is never finished.
No, it's an ongoing process.
There's always more to explore, more to question,
And the more you learn,
more to understand.
the more you realize you don't know.
What better guide could we have on that journey than Plato?
He's a fantastic guy.
Even thousands of years later,
Right.
his ideas have the power to spark debate,
I mean, the questions that he was wrestling with
challenge our assumptions,
are still relevant today.
and push us to think more deeply about ourselves
So if you're feeling overwhelmed
and the world around us.
by all,
So for our listeners who might be feeling overwhelmed with all
Yeah.
these abstract concepts
just remember,
and philosophical puzzles,
don't be afraid to question.
what's the one key takeaway
Yeah.
you'd want them to hold on to
Don't be afraid to challenge
from Volume 4 of Plato's Dialogues?
your own beliefs.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to embrace the mystery of the unknown. Because sometimes the more you dig, the more you realize
Yeah.
there's to discover.
It's a reminder that the true joy of learning
Absolutely.
lies in the ongoing process
It's the journey,
of discovery.
not the destination.
Thanks for taking us on this deep dive
My pleasure.
into Plato's later dialogues.
Always happy to talk about Plato.
And to our listeners,
Yeah.
if you're ready for a mental workout,
Pick up Volume 4.
pick up Volume 4 of Plato's Dialogues
See what you think.
and see where the journey takes you.
You might be surprised.
You might just find that these ancient texts
Yeah.
have a surprising amount to say
They're still relevant.
about the complexities of our modern world.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Take care.